I want you for just a second to imagine that heaven is real. What does it look like? What's going on? What are you doing if you get to heaven? I've been teaching at Judge for 2 years now, and I teach a very specific class, theology. Last year, I taught sophomores. This year, I teach juniors. And the subjects of these two classes are very different. For sophomores, you learn Christology and ecclesiology. And as juniors, you learn sacraments and morality. I have taught all of my students since I began teaching that there's something that we are all working towards. I am under the firm belief that all human beings have this same telos, and that every detail that I put into my classes was in some way or another trying to lead us to that same telos that we are all working towards. But how do we get to that telos? Through Christology, ecclesiology, sacraments, morality. How do we get to that telos? Through history, through science, through math, through art. School has a telos. Academics has a telos, and it's more than just getting an education. It's more than just getting the prerequisites to have a job in the future. It's all for something much greater than we can comprehend. How do we understand that? Well, I want you to, especially if you had me last year as your teacher, I want you to look back at every single thing that I taught you, every single activity that we did, every single assignment that we did. Chances are many times you may have felt what we were doing had nothing to do with the subject matter that was at hand. And to a certain extent, you're right. Think back to what we studied this year, or not necessarily what we studied, but the things that we did. We did art history and art critique. We did literature. We did some theology. We did a lot of philosophy. I want you to combine all of those things. What is the one thing that I could show you all to capture everything that I've wanted to teach you from my first day on the job and from your first day as sophomores to this very day? What is the one thing that we can look at that encapsulates every detail that I want to get across to you all? Every detail that allows us to get a step closer to our telos. I found it. I found the one thing, the one tool that we can use to find our telos. And all we have to do is read Dante's third book of the Divine Comedy, Paradiso. As you all know by now, Paradiso is the story of Dante Alighieri moving from purgatory to heaven, and it follows his journey through the different parts of heaven. It captures through beautiful language, and only through language, not through visual imagery, but it captures the beauty and the magnitude that heaven could possibly be. This is why I want you to think about this question. If heaven is real, what does it look like? And what are you doing? Heaven has been the destination for human beings, at least in our minds. I guess you could say, heaven has been the destination that we've wanted to get to. It's what we have been working towards as humans our entire lives. Even if it's a totally made-up concept, it has defined every aspect of daily life. And even if you are someone who doesn't believe in heaven, you live in a society that was built up and constructed by individuals who were working in order to get to heaven. In one way or another, every detail of your life is defined by somebody's interpretation of what heaven is and how much closer can we get to it. And it's not one culture. It's every single culture that has a concept of this afterlife that we're working towards. And there's a common denominator amongst every culture's understanding of heaven. And that common denominator is that it's up. It's up in the sky. It's in space. It's just far away. It's unreachable, at least now. Think of all of the TV shows and movies that deal with heaven. All of them, in some way or another, insinuate that heaven is upwards and that you are moving up. And when Dante writes Paradiso, this is no different. Dante's interpretation of heaven is just space. And so we're going to travel very briefly through heaven. And by traveling through heaven, we are traveling through space. We're hopping from planet to planet. And we're seeing where these different people live and why they live there in those specific areas. There's a couple of things that I want you to understand before we jump in, though. This is a 14th century interpretation of space. So even though he may get some bodies correct, some planets correct in their names, the order may be outdated and out of place. Remember, this is a geocentric idea of the universe. And at the same time, this is not meant to be a literal interpretation of heaven, and it's not meant to be a scientific book. This is poetry, and we need to read it as poetry. And as soon as you can separate the literal imagery from the poetic imagery, your life is going to change by understanding the beauty that is Dante's Paradiso. Now, I could give you a rundown, a synopsis of the story, or I could have you map it out in the way that we did with Purgatorio and Inferno, but I'm going to do something a little different. In the same way that Dante had a tour guide, so to speak, through all three levels of existence, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, I'm going to use a tour guide for myself. And so we're only going to hit some topics within Paradiso, but these are the topics that this tour guide has chosen. For whatever reason, he has determined that these are the important images that he wants you to know about Paradiso. And he's actually a really important figure. He's actually a figure that you all should know the work of. In fact, it plays a large role in how you may interpret my class, especially this spring semester. He's a French artist by the name of Gustave Doré. Doré was best known as an illustrator, and he illustrated many literature works. Now, illustration was not a common thing at the time that Doré was alive, and he certainly helped make it a more popular art form. But he's super important to the history of both literature and art, because many of the images that we come up with when we think about different stories come from the mind of Gustave Doré, because he is, in many examples, he is the first individual who visualized the text of literature. And so there are plenty of examples in which we read a book and we have an image of what this scene may look like or who this character may look like, because Gustave Doré illustrated that. Some examples include biblical scenes, such as when Jacob wrestles with an angel, the Tower of Babel scene, when the individuals who are living in Babel tried to build a tower and God disperses them. Even more common ideas such as Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood was a fairy tale that wasn't illustrated until Gustave Doré comes and adds illustrations to the text. But there is nothing that Gustave Doré is more famous for than his illustrations of all 3 books of Dante's Divine Comedy. He has an extensive collection of illustrations that are based on scenes in the Inferno. He has an extensive collection of illustrations that are based on scenes from the Book of Purgatorio. But by far my favorite works of him come from Dante's Paradiso. Because when I read Dante's Paradiso, it's one of the few times in life where I feel like a human being has captured what heaven may truly be like. But it's only in words. And there's something magical about reading a book. You create these images in your brain and in your mind, and it would be wonderful if you could express those images on paper or in picture form. But not all of us are very talented when it comes to art. Gustave Doré does this for us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the scenes that Gustave Doré illustrated from Dante's Paradiso. We're going to unpack them, and they are going to give us a glimpse into what heaven may look like. So you all read the first canto of the Book of Paradiso back at the beginning of this quarter, and you took a quiz on it. So if you want to understand where we're leaving off, go back to that quiz that you took and go back to Canto Uno, the first canto. Dante is led by Beatrice through heaven and through, as we know it, quote-unquote, space. And as they're moving from that first canto, they move into the first level of existence, physically. The first sphere, as it's called, and that's the moon. And so they land on the moon. Now, if we look back at the Inferno and we look back at Purgatorio, both of those 2 levels of existence, those 2 planes of existence, were defined by sin. And you were where you were based on your sin. In heaven, there is no sin. Sin is over. Sin has been defeated. And so you don't go where you are based on sin. You don't get closer to God because you sinned less, and you don't become further away from God because you sinned more. In a very unique way, Dante turns this way of construction, this way of organizing heaven, he turns it on its head, and no longer is he defining things by the 7 deadly sins. He's defining these things by virtues. We have four cardinal virtues, and we have 3 theological virtues. The opposite of the 7 deadly sins. And the first sphere that they travel to, the moon, is based on, the people that live there is based on individuals who are defined by the cardinal virtue of fortitude, of, I guess you could give it another word, inner strength. I want you to go out tonight and look up at the moon. And I want you to go out a week from now and look up at the moon. These 2 visualizations of the same object are going to be completely different. We call this waxing and waning. The moon moves, it goes in and out, and it causes this movement of in and out on Earth as well. the tides are defined by the waxing and the waning of the moon. The tides ebb and flow. And this has often been used by poetry and artists as an interpretation or a visualization of life itself. Life ebbs and flows. Life waxes and wanes. There are highs and there are lows. There's something inconstant about this. There's something unexpected about this. There are times when you are closer with the people you love and times where you are further away from them. And so the people who are here living on the moon in Dante's Paradiso are those who dealt with inconstancy in their life. And he encounters one woman, a woman by the name of Picarda. Gustave Doré visualizes Picarda as this beautiful woman, and she seems to be standing in clouds, and Dante places himself in a position of being lower than her, being lower than Beatrice to his side, and all the figures in the background. He is at their service, and he is here to learn from this woman, Picarda. Picarda was a nun who was forcibly removed from her convent, and she died after she was forcibly removed. And so this idea of being moved away from where she thought she was meant to be, the convent, was an example of inconstance, of inconsistency as well. And so Dante learns from Picarda that though we are moved from one place to another outside of our own control, we're always thrown to, or we are always placed at where we are meant to be. And in her description of the moon, she says, "I am blessed to be here, the slowest and most constant place in the celestial spheres. I am meant to be here." You see, the moon appears to be it appears to be constant rather than inconstant, because it looks different from one day to the next when we look outside. But unlike the other planets, and again, this is using the scientific mind of a 14th century Italian, unlike the other planets, the moon is stable. It is nearest to Earth, and it revolves around Earth with a form of inconstancy. There is a stability there. What Dante is doing here is he is saying that though life may appear to be constant, and it moves, it ebbs and flows, it waxes and wanes, there is stability to where you are meant to be. And so an individual like Picarda is going to be placed in a sphere that is inconstant, that guarantees that she is where she was meant to be. And so with that, Dante and Beatrice move from the first sphere to the second sphere. And this is the sphere, or the planet, of Mercury. People that exist on this sphere exist here because in one form or another, they were ambitious in their lifetime. Now, ambition has the ability to blind us and prevent us from doing good things. I'm sure many of you have an ambition in your life to make money, to be successful, to go to a good college. And that's good, but that ambition may force you away from doing good things, from living a moral life, especially if it requires trampling on others to get to that position. And so the individuals that live on Mercury spend time there to learn and to grow in the cardinal virtue of justice. Now go back to Plato's Republic. Now we never went over Plato's Republic, but I've explained it a little bit to you. The whole premise of this story is that Socrates and these other Greek philosophers are just sitting around and having a long discussion on this question, what is justice? It's one of the most important questions a human being can answer. And the souls that are lucky enough to be living on Mercury who define their lives by ambition have the opportunity to learn what is justice. I never grew up as much of an outdoors person. I was always an indoor kid, and I was raised by a very indoor loving mother. And I remember, I really have no experience with nature in general. And I remember one time for my birthday when I was a junior in college, my roommates took me to Japanese gardens in Fort Worth, Texas. And so we were just walking around the gardens. It was really, really beautiful. And there was a giant koi pond. Now, I've never really had experience with koi ponds, but if you have, you know this experience. There were feeding machines where you could put a quarter in and get some fish food and just throw it in the pond and the koi will come up and get it. I was a college kid. I wasn't about to spend 25 cents on fish food, but there was plenty of fish food just lying on the ground. And so I picked some up and I went up to the koi pond, and I couldn't really see the koi. Maybe there was some in the center of the pond. It was a really big pond, and I was standing at the edge, and I threw a piece, just one little morsel of fish food into the water, and immediately about 50 koi come up to try to get the food. And as soon as they come up and one of the koi gets that one piece, that one morsel, all of them are just there with their mouths open waiting for me. Now, I'm shocked because I've never had this experience before. I'm not familiar with koi, and it's just weird that they're just so desperate for food. They're just waiting there on top of each other with their mouths open waiting for food. And so much so that you can't really see the water anymore. There's just so many koi. And so I start throwing out fish food. Well, Dante gets this exact same feeling when he moves from the moon to Mercury. He and Beatrice are ascending up to Mercury. They see these thousands of souls, and we get actually 2 images from Gustave Doré of this scene. He gets thousands of souls and compares them to these fish that are swarming onto something new. And as he's approaching this group of souls, they're so excited because they say this one individual, just one individual, is going to multiply the love that we have on this sphere 1,000-fold. And this stuns Dante as he's approaching the second sphere. That the simplicity of him as an individual is going to make the love of Mercury stronger. Now, who are the individuals that live on Mercury? They're not exactly individuals that you would think of love. There's one individual in particular that I want to focus on that Gustave Doré does not. It's an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Justinian. I'm hoping that you studied him when you were doing world history or European history. A very important figure, but he says something really important to Dante. I was Caesar, and I am Justinian. See, on this sphere, we were obsessed with ambition. We wanted power for ourselves, and we got it in some form or another. I became the leader of Europe. I became leader of the known world. I became Caesar. But that's who I used to be. I still am Justinian. I still am my own person. But all that power, all that ambition that I worked towards in my earthly life is gone. I'm no longer Caesar. It is now his position in the afterlife to learn what justice is and to leave ambition behind. And so Dante and Beatrice move from the second sphere to the third sphere. And the third sphere is the sphere of Venus. And Dante describes this sphere as the sphere for lovers. Lovers are the ones who reside on this sphere because they are trying to learn the cardinal virtue of temperance. When we love things in life, it becomes very difficult for us to hold true to the virtue of temperance. I may love junk food, but if I eat it too much, if I have more than I should, that's going against temperance. Temperance is making sure that what you consume or what you do is not addictive. Whenever there's something that we love, it tends to become addictive because it gives us pleasure, it gives us happiness. And so for people who are lovers, they need to learn this virtue of temperance. And so Dante learns from the souls on this level about the virtue of temperance and about what it means to actually love. Dante knows that he is approaching the sphere of Venus, the sphere of love, because the individual that he loves more than anyone, Beatrice, is becoming more lovely in sight and more beautiful the closer they approach this new sphere. And as they approach the sphere, and as they're on the sphere, they come across this radiant light, this bright, bright light. And Dante asks Beatrice, "Can I ask this light who it is?" Beatrice says, "Okay." And so Dante asks, and the light grows brighter. And it says, "I'm so glad you asked," essentially. "I used to be a king of France, and if my sons were any smarter or better, our family would have ruled for much longer." The individual is somebody who is actually a close friend, most likely, of the historical figure Dante, a man by the name of Charles Martel. Now, not the more famous Charles Martel that you may have heard of before. This is a lesser-known Charles Martel. Charles Martel was a king, but his sons were not, let's just say they weren't right for the job. So Dante asks him this very philosophical question: how is it possible that a bad son can come from a good father? And Charles, his answer to Dante is essentially providence. And this goes back to what Dante tried to explain at the sphere of the moon. Life consists of ebbs and flows, of goods and bads, of highs and lows. In the same way, the order of the universe consists of a balance between chaos and order. If you know the Tao, or Taoism, you know this very famous symbol of two, I guess you could call them droplets, with a single dot in each one. And together, these two complete opposites form one harmonious whole. This is this balance between chaos and order. And Charles says this is only possible through the providence of God. The natural order of things is not actually order, it's chaos. And God's providence allows order to come in. So it's not a matter of bad sons coming from good fathers, but it's a matter of good fathers existing in the first place. It's only possible through the providence of God. Dante seems to be satisfied with his answer because he moves on from Charles Martel. Actually, before I move on from the sphere of Venus and the sphere of love, this isn't explained in Doré's illustrations, but Dante learns something very important in this sphere. He learns from another individual, I'm blanking on the name, that the church is in a sorry state at the time. The Catholic Church is completely corrupt, and it's filled with horrible people, and bad things are happening in the church. And this individual explains to him, in this sphere of Venus, that it is through the city of Florence, and it's through 3 popes specifically, that the church as a whole is crumbling and collapsing. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, so I'm going to leave it there, but just be aware. This is not a new critique of the church being corrupt or being bad, or the people that make up at least the authority aspect of the church are doing a bad job. Because Dante has alluded to this in both the Inferno and Purgatorio, and now he's alluding to it in Paradiso. And now he's blaming the entire city of Florence. But more on that later on in the story. Now we get to one of my favorite parts of the story, because it incorporates so much of what I have taught you over the past 2 years. He moves from the sphere of Venus to the sphere of the sun. Now the sun is the brightest of the spheres, according to Dante. Now he knows that all of these orbs, these spheres, exist in space, and he thinks that the sun is just merely another one of those. Again, we're dealing with 14th century science. It's not exactly precise. But the sun is by far the largest, and the sun is by far the brightest. And so as he approaches this sphere, he knows that whatever exists on this sphere is going to be the most important. The brightness of the sun reflects wisdom, and so the people that are going to reside on this sphere are going to be the wisest individuals in the entirety of heaven. And remember, we're dealing with the cardinal virtues right now. And there are 4 cardinal virtues. We've dealt with 3 in the past 3 spheres. And so the final sphere that deals with the cardinal virtue is the sun. And the cardinal virtue that these individuals are learning and growing in is the cardinal virtue of prudence, knowing when certain things happen. I've mentioned the show very often because I love the show. The Young Pope is about an individual who becomes Pope, who is feisty and mean, and everybody hates him and thinks he's a bad person and does not want him to be Pope. But there are 2 details about him that are clear throughout the entire series. He is wise and he is prudent. Now he is this character, Pope Pius XIII in The Young Pope, is clearly an allegory to so many of the individuals that Dante encounters in this sphere. Many of these individuals that he encounters are individuals that we have come across in class. He encounters Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was taught by another important figure, St. Albert the Great, who I never really mentioned in class, but everything that Thomas Aquinas knows, he learned from St. Albert the Great. He encounters King Solomon, the figure who I mentioned in my last note sheet, who is given the opportunity to ask for any one thing, and God will grant it to him, and he asks for wisdom. He encounters Boethius, who you should know by now is the person who gave us our definition of a person, an individual substance of a rational nature. He encounters an individual that I haven't mentioned by name, but I've definitely mentioned his work, a man by the name of Richard of St. Victor, a monk who lived about 1,000 years ago, who came up with a rational explanation for the Trinity. Including all of these philosophers and all of these people that we know, we also encounter saints. We encounter St. Francis of Assisi. We encounter St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominicans. The sun is the residing space, I guess you could call it, of all things wise and prudent. And it is where any good Christian would want to reside themselves. All of these souls express themselves in a way that Gustave Doré gives us a visualization of. They process in rings, in 24 rings. All of these souls are in 24 rings, and they're processing within one another. And so what Dante visualizes, as you can see in this image, it's this amazing harmony of 24 individual rings consisting of the greatest and holiest souls to exist in the history of the church. And this harmony is not just visual, they're also singing. They're singing about the Trinity. Now, these 24 go back to the very end of Purgatorio, if you can remember the procession and the 24 elders. There is a consistency here between the imagery that we find in Scripture, the imagery that we find in the stories of Israel. Remember, King Solomon is here. We have it throughout the Catholic Church and through numerology. And all of it is simply for the glory of the Trinity. And so Dante is overcome with emotion and overcome with a reaction to this beauty because it is so harmonious. And you can see this harmony very clearly in Gustave Doré's illustration. Now, the most intense thing about this scene, which Doré captures a little bit with his use of shading, is that these souls are uncharacteristically bright. They are emitting a crazy amount of light. And so Dante asks Beatrice, who then says, you know what, you can ask these souls, are you always going to be this bright? And it's King Solomon who comes and answers for the rest of the souls. And he says, we are as bright as God loves us. And the brighter we are means that God has allowed us to receive more love than someone who is less bright. But Solomon makes an important caveat here. This brightness is incomplete. Now, in Catholic theology, we believe in the resurrection of the body, that when all is said and done, at the end of time, our souls and our bodies are going to be reunited with one another, which is why we think the body is so important. And right now, these souls that Dante is looking at, they do not have their body. And so Solomon says to Dante, once we are reunited with our bodies, this brilliance will be not in degree and not in different shades of brightness. It'll just be perfection, because we will be perfected. Dante, he listens to this, but he sees something in the distance. Even brighter souls, even brighter figures. And he says, I want to go check that out.